All right, now let's talk about borders. We briefly talked about the border property before, but let's revisit it one more time with more detail. So this property takes 3 values. The first value is the thickness of the border. We can use 1 pixel for a really thin border, or 10 pixels for a thicker border. The second value is the style of the border. We can use solid, but we have other styles that we're going to look at in this lesson. The third value is the color. I'm going to go with royal blue. Once again, we can use a hexadecimal color or an RGB color and so on. So let's see what we get. Now, let's change solid to dotted. So instead of a solid line, we get a bunch of dots. Another popular style is dashed. Here's what we get. We have a bunch of other styles, but quite frankly, nobody uses them anymore. We used those styles 20 years ago, so I'm not going to go over them. Now, one thing you need to understand here is that this border property is what we call a shorthand property. It takes these values and applies them to borders on each side. But in CSS, we have a few other properties for defining the border on each side. For example, we can say border top should be 20 pixels, solid, royal blue. Let's see what we get. So the top border is thicker. Similarly, we have border right, border bottom, and border left. Now, one thing you need to pay attention to here is that the order of these lines matters. So here we have defined the general border on each side, that is 10 pixels thick, but then we are saying the top border should be 20 pixels thick. If I move this line up, see what we get? All borders are the same. So the order of these lines matters. In addition to border top, border right, border bottom, and border left, we also have border width. With this, we can specify the width of all borders. So remember this shape: top, right, bottom, left. This is how I memorize this syntax. So the first value represents the width of the top border. Let's say 10 pixels. The second value represents the width of the right border, 20 pixels. Then we have bottom and then left. Let's see what we get. So top, right, bottom, and left. Now, another way to memorize this is TRBL. Top, right, bottom, left. You can say turbo. Now what we have on the right side is called a comment. We use comments to explain why we have done something in our code. They're completely ignored by browsers, okay? So this is how we can remember this syntax. Now, what if we remove one of these values? That was the width of the left border. In this case, the browser uses the same value as the right border. So take a look. We get the same result as before. Now, what if we remove this other value? That was the width of the bottom border. In this case, the browser takes the width of the top border. So once again, we get the same result as before. So in summary, 1020 is the same as 1020, 1020. This is the short way of writing this code. Now, what if we remove this value? We only have 10 pixels. The browser will apply this width to all borders, okay? Now, similarly, we have border style. Once again, we can supply different styles for top, right, bottom, and left borders. And we also have border color. Now, we have other longhand properties like border top color, border left color, and so on. But quite frankly, they're hardly used. 99% of the time, we use the shorthand form. So you don't need to memorize any of these properties. Just be aware that you have full control over the width, style, and color of each of the borders, okay? Now, one other property we're going to talk about in this lesson is border radius. We briefly talked about this before. With border radius, we can make the corners round. So if we supply a value like 10 pixels, we get a little bit of round corners. If we increase this value and say 50 pixels, we get even more rounded corners. Now, earlier I showed you a trick. If you have a square, so let's change the width to 200 pixels. If you have a square and set the border radius to 100%, we get a full circle. Now, using CSS, we can also create other shapes like triangles, stars, and so on. I'm not going to go over them in this course because they become repetitive. You can learn them on your own. Let me just show you what to look for. So in Google, search for CSS shapes, and Look at this article on csstricks.com, The Shapes of CSS. This is a great website for learning CSS. So this is how we can create a square. We can also create a rectangle, circle, which you have seen. Now, in this example, we have border radius set to 50%. That should work most of the time, but in my experience, sometimes we don't get a perfect circle. So I personally prefer to use 100% for the border radius. Then we have oval, triangle up, triangle down, and so on. So in case you're curious, look at this page to see what other shapes you can create with CSS.